Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about House of Chains, Book 4 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but from the perspective of having read the series before, a reread of this book with whole series spoilers. Now, I know I had previously done a video where I was talking to Steven Erikson about this, but as is what usually happens when Erikson and I talk, we went off on a tangent and never really circled back to it. So this is my attempt to bring up a bunch of the points that I meant to bring up that time, but totally forgot about. So if you have not read the 10 books of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, I am going to be talking about House of Chains, but in relation to the whole series. So there will be whole series spoilers. If you want to keep your experience spoiler free, thank you very much for watching so far. But you might want to come back after you finish the series. For those of you that don't care about spoilers or have read the series, let's get started in this then. So the first thing is I want to talk about is obviously something that Erikson and I touched on, which is the importance of Karsa Orla. So Kamensod, in looking at this whole story, focuses the first part of this book on Karsa. So what do we take from that? And if we think in Gardens of the Moon, some of the central characters, it was a focus that we can look at in terms of them, where how they were being manipulated by gods, by other powers, that they were pawns in someone else's game. In Deadhouse Gates, we again see that, but we have a focus more on victim because of Fellison. But again, there are other elements. But Fellison is the first time we sort of have a focus on a victim's point of view. With Memories of Ice, we move back into a dealing with someone who it turns out is a victim. The Panion Seer is a victim. How he acted, how he lashed out, but we're not given his perspective. So we had Fellison, the perspective of the victim. The Panion Seer is a being that is being dealt with, and then how that resolves. With Karsa, we are now being put in the position of someone who is a perpetrator of violence, who is a perpetrator of evil, misdeeds, abuse, pain, suffering. That's who he begins as. Then he becomes a victim. And that's the story that we see of Karsa at the beginning of House of Chains. So this is the first book that really drills down into what makes someone perpetrate these things. What do they do? Can that ever be forgiven? Can it be understood? Can it be forgiven? Can it be rationalized? These are all questions that are being posed by the analysis of Karsa's story. Because it's not about going, oh, well, Karsa's fine. We look at those things. He is arrogant. He is violent. He is dismissive. He has bought into a false ideology. Not only has his culture been shaped by Icarium, and it is an abhorrent structure because Icarium, while he had maybe good intentions, didn't think it through and actually came up with a really bad thing and then buggered off and left them to their own devices. And now Karsa has grown up in this very strange culture that is radically different from our own, and in a lot of ways, completely and utterly what we would term barbaric, um, ritualized attacks and murder and rape. That's acceptable in his culture. So it's asking a lot to try and imagine this alien culture, this person from this alien culture, and then seeing how they react to the rest of the world. But we then see Karsa turned into a victim. Does Karsa's suffering, his enslavement, his torture, the things that he goes through, is that enough? Is that recompense enough for the devastation and suffering that he has caused? Are we thinking in terms of retributive justice, that he has now been forgiven what he did before because he went through a lot of bad things? Are we thinking of restorative justice, that he has now been brought round, rectified? He can now be a bona fide member of a society and be a beneficial member of society. He has paid for his crimes, he has learned from his crimes, and now he's going to be a better person. These are questions that are raised by Karsa's story. But even more than that, we return to Fellison's story, and we see that she was the victim from Deadhouse Gates, and we see how her victim's journey ends. And this is also the first major introduction of Tavor. Yes, we have met Tavor before, very, very briefly, a couple of times, but now we get much more focus on who Tavor is. We see her actions, but again, externally, we're viewing her from the outside. We're seeing how the army responds to her. But this is her first sort of major moment to be in the narrative. This is where she truly enters the narrative. And she is the one that unknowingly kills her sister. And so we see how a victim, Felicin, has been treated by her own family, albeit unknowingly. So again, a lot of questions are being raised by Kamansad about how we think of victims, how we treat victims, how we expect victims to behave, and whether or not we will forgive them. And interestingly, in sort of comparison to Karsa, we have Bidithal. And Bidithal is again an unrepentant monster. Now, Karsa doesn't go through a whole Damascenian moment where the scales have fallen from his eyes and he seeks forgiveness for the world. No, Karsa's change is gradual. But we see Bidithal, and Bidithal is this unrepentant monster. He is not a victim. He makes victims. He is a perpetrator of horrendous and horrific violent acts and knows that he is doing this. He is doing this for his own gratification, for his own sense of power, for his own sense of importance. Karsa bought into a cultural reality and then had that challenged. And in that challenge, saw that he could learn, he could grow, he could change. Bidithal is well aware of all of these other cultures and still maintains, no, I'm going to do this because I want to. I like doing it. I like inflicting pain. And he is perhaps the first truly villainous character that we see that I don't think has any redeeming features. And we can maybe quibble and argue about some other characters, but in many of them, they were flaws that were being exploited, or they had shortcomings as characters that led them to do dumb or horrendous things, or they had organizational abilities. Malagrel the Merciful springs to mind, who, while he is manipulative and is deeply invested in realpolitik and is horrendously manipulative and self-serving, he's exceptionally talented. He's very good at it. He's a survivor. He knows how to organize things. He's all about efficiency and avoiding blame. I'm not saying he's a good person, but there are elements to it that we can admire what he achieves without agreeing with how he achieved it. With Bidithal, there is nothing to admire. This is someone without any merit. And he is a very neat contrast to Karsa because he is just as barbaric as Karsa, if not more barbaric than Karsa, without any of the excuses of growing up in an isolated, parochial, sheltered worldview. He has none of those excuses. He has access to the best education, all these different cultures, and he still maintains his desire and ability to wound and inflict horrendous harm on the young, on the innocent, on the defenseless. Bidithal has no redeeming qualities. And at the end, when we think of what Karsa does, Karsa punishes him in the most biblical eye for an eye kind of way. It is absolutely barbaric. The very things that at the beginning we condemned Karsa for are the things that at the end we see that in a certain light, yes, this is the right thing to do, but it is barbaric. This is not justice being served. This is just meting out a form of punishment. Bidithal hasn't been dragged in front of a court, shown the error of his ways, being told, you have broken the law, you have broken these things, you have done all these things were evil. No, Karsa walks up, rips off his genitals, stuffs them in his throat, and kills him. Bidithal doesn't learn anything from this. He just ends up dead, and dead far more quickly than I think a lot of us would have wanted him. We would have wanted him to suffer a lot longer. But that is absolutely barbaric behavior. Karsa acts as judge, jury, and executioner. That is not something that generally, as civilized people, that we want or we celebrate. But in that case, because Bidethul is so evil, we celebrate it. So Kamensaud is asking us, well, what's the difference? Why can one set of barbarian acts be potentially redeemable or potentially forgivable? And the other set of barbarian acts, why do we celebrate when that guy's punished? What is the difference? Where is the dividing line? And these are very important questions because it's not Kamensaud saying this is the difference. It's Kamensaud giving us these examples and saying, right, is this fair? Why isn't it fair? Is this fair? Then why is this fair? What are the distinctions? Where are we drawing these lines? And I think these are very powerful points because from this point on, one of the major focuses of the Malazan Book of the Fall focuses on victims and the perpetrators of violence and abuse. This is a constant thread running through these books, looking at what acts can be forgiven, what acts can we expect redemption for? Can we ever be redeemed for everything? Can we ever be forgiven for things? Because remember, Kamensaud is working through, why did these people free me? This is what he is struggling to understand. Because when we think of all the things that Kamensaud did, all of the terrible, monstrous, horrendous things that led to untold numbers of people dying and suffering, still the humans and the gods of this world eventually came around and freed him. And this is a question that is at the center of his investigation, because they saw him as a victim. Yes, it's not entirely altruistic, because his presence and his followers arriving in the Jade Statues could have destroyed the world. And therefore, by freeing him, they also saved the world. He was having a deleterious effect on the reality. But at the same time, they could have tried to find a way to destroy him. But instead, they found a way to make him incarnate, kill him, so his spiritual essence could flee the plane. And I suppose this is also why we have the example with Fenner being brought into the story, and Fenner being called down as a little sub story that occurred earlier that foreshadows what exactly happens to the crippled god at the end. And of course, Karsa is instrumental in this. But that, I think, is at the heart of House of Chains. This tragedy, the tragedy of understanding that not all victims find solace or rescue. Not all victims have the ability to rescue themselves. Some victims are taken advantage of and never find a way out. Others end up being punished by the very people who were trying to save them. And this focus on the importance of understanding victims, not the act, not talking about the act, depicting the act in all its salacious glory, but focusing on the ramification for the person that the act was done to. This is something that I think Kamensaud takes greater and greater interest in as the series develops. And we see so many different iterations of people struggling with various things from their past and sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing. But it shows how they try to deal with the ramifications of what happened to them. And it doesn't always work out well. But I think this is part of Kamensaud's investigation into what he sees as the human condition, this cycle of violence, this perpetration of violence, of war and battles, but also what we do to each other. And for me, that is one of the most interesting things, that yes, it begins with Karsa, looking at Karsa, thinking about Karsa's story, but it leads to this more abstract notion of, well, Karsus started out as a perpetrator of violence, then turned his back on that, served as a bodyguard to Druzhna, and obviously, well done, Karsa, sterling job, abandons the camp, and when he returns, sees that the others have not stepped up in their role and administers brutal, barbaric justice as he sees it. And Kamensod asks the question, well, why is that type of barbarism fine, but other types of barbarism aren't? But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.